Another abandoned crocodile in the water ahead of us. Oh. Oh, barge! Or no, sorry, frigate inbound. I don't know if we have anything to take that.
Iron ship.
Iron ship, my bad.
Not a frigate.
Oh, we're just gonna go past him. He can't do anything.
Hey.
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 Really?
We have a collie.
I said frigate. I think I meant to say freighter, and that was still wrong.
I thought you meant Strider.
It is a
at
freighter.
first.
It's a freighter.
Yeah, sorry. That I meant to say freighter, the other ship that starts with an F. Troops, I saw a bear here. Welcome back to another suggestion series for Foxhole. This time, variety for victory, changing up Foxhole's victory conditions. And as a friendly reminder, the cover art for this suggestion series was an older art piece done by Sam Satirai. Seriously, their work is awesome. You should go check out their portfolio. So, what will we discuss? We'll start off discussions with the current conquest limitations, the new victory conditions philosophy and my thinking behind it, the feasibility for the devs to actually add any of the suggested conditions, new victory condition ideas, including some more normal ideas and some certainly less normal ideas, single or multi-conditional victories, and differing conditions. And we'll wrap up with a conclusion. A disclaimer, this is not a recent idea. This suggestion series has been in the works for some time, and I've talked about it on stream basically for years at this point. When I was on the Boneyard Foxhole podcast, hosted by Barebones Gaming, 7 months ago, before the Airborne War, when I was still playing Colonial, I had pitched many of these ideas on that podcast, so don't at me if you think I came up with this just last week. So, some current conquest limitations. Capturing up to 32 victory points narrows the potential focus and strategy that any one faction can have. Sure, there's lots of freedoms and how to approach certain objectives, but when you've been fighting for the same last couple of towns for close to a decade at this point, your strategy doesn't often differ from simply what the most efficient way to get to those victory points are. In fact, these conditions have basically been identical since 2018 in Update 0.9, back when the map used to look like this. The only changes that have been made have been to the number of victory points as the map has expanded. Only recently, since the devs after Airborne have started doing shorter update cycles, has any alteration to the win conditions formula been added, and these have been added largely in the form of time limits, where a victory is declared for one side or the other, simply based on who has the majority of capture points and other smaller factors. We'll talk about this a little bit more with the new conditions philosophy. Simply put, I had these ideas just because I wanted to add more variety to the game. Bringing this screen back up, some of you Civilization players might recognize this as the Civilization victory conditions. Many of these conditions have been inspired from older RTS games. Foxhole's world conquest might be described in Civilization terms as a domination victory, but what if there were other types of victory in Foxhole? Science might make sense if you do a tech race. Culture is mainly for the Reddit, and religious victory I don't even want to consider what that might be for Foxhole. Either way, these are just examples of other games as victory conditions. Altering the victory conditions might be able to bring new importance to forgotten towns and lesser used aspects of the game. And again, certain victory conditions might also potentially incentivize the, quote, losing team to fight until the very end. But again, we'll discuss that later in the ideas section. And it would also be nice to simply mirror the dynamic war start conditions. Most war start conditions in Foxhole are at least slightly different, be that different starting positions, different logistical hub layouts, and different resource locations. Feasibility to add new victory conditions. Well, recently, new victory conditions have been added, as mentioned before. The shorter war cycle has introduced time limits to wars and other minor conditions. Hopefully this means that some of the more, quote, normal ideas I'm suggesting wouldn't be too much of a stretch to code, though admittedly, the wacky ideas I have in this presentation will certainly be harder to implement, but might be fun nonetheless. No relation to these war conditions. Okay, so what are some new normal conditions I've had ideas for over the years? One example is naval or air dominance. capture all ports or airfields on the map. Although this is still very close to a victory points win condition, this refocuses the fight on either air or naval assets, depending on what you choose to go with. Though, of course, these goals would still be achievable by land forces, since ports and airfields can be captured by ground troops. But certainly, instead of having a gun for Callum's Cape, Reaching Trail, Basin Cyanach for the Colonials, or Red River, Akrithia, and Kalakai for the Wardens, maybe this refocuses the fight towards the extremities and towards the coastlines. Another idea is means of production, or produce X amount of goods. Maybe the key to victory for one war isn't necessarily the frontline fighting, but it's instead the production of logistical assets, refocusing the efforts towards the backlines, keeping your production lines open so that they can hit the production goal to help win the war. Isoroku Yamamoto, the Japanese admiral, often is quoted, or more likely misquoted since it's not evident that he ever actually said this, as saying, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." That's in relation to the fact that he'd known that the US industrial capacity would far outstrip Japan's in a long, protracted war, and if they were not able to end the war rapidly, they would almost certainly be defeated. And while it's not always true that simply being able to outproduce your enemy is a sure way to achieve victory in an actual war, there's plenty of times countries have surrendered once they realized the odds were simply stacked against them. Germany during the First World War still had plenty of ground to fight for, but instead chose to sign an armistice rather than have much of the fighting transition over to German soil, simply setting the conditions to be destroying and or seizing all enemy mass production factories would probably be easier to implement, although that strays pretty close to victory points conditions again. If it were only to destroy all enemy factories, though, that would certainly put an increased importance on nukes, air power, and air defenses. And the last condition idea for more normal ideas is to bleed them white. But killing X amount of enemy troops might place more importance on the medic roles and medics having to keep soldiers alive, ferrying wounded troops to the hospital, etc. Although it certainly would turn the front line into a bloodbath, though it might also encourage factions to play more defensively rather than aggressively, since on average, you'll lose more troops on the offensive than you will on the defensive. How about some wackier victory conditions? Now this pulls a lot more from old RTS games. Wonders. Build and maintain a or multiple special buildings. And just as the name suggests, this is pulled straight from Age of Empires, Age of Mythologies, and again, 0 AD, which I've been playing a lot recently. Essentially, you build a special building, and you keep it maintained and up for a certain amount of time, and then your faction is declared victorious. King of the Hill. Now, I was discussing a lot of these ideas on streams, and some of the chatters mentioned a King of the Hill mode. Both factions are tasked with holding rotating map areas until a score limit is reached. As long as your team holds it, you gain points. And when your team overall reaches a certain point threshold, then you're declared the victor. This one I'm calling Bite and Hold, though I think a better name could be found for it at some point. Essentially, the idea is to reach a certain location with a certain unit. Picture this scenario. What if the victory wasn't about taking enemy town halls and victory points, but instead getting something like a train or a locomotive to the enemy capital city, or several enemy rear line towns? Let's say the Colonials are on the offensive, and their objective was to get a train to both Callum's Cape and the Great Warden Dam. This would produce similar fighting to what you see now in World Conquest with victory points, but then there would be this extra emphasis on actually establishing rail lines deep into enemy territory, giving a lot of roles for builders and engineers towards the front lines. It would also make a mad rush for the Wardens to try and stop this train, even at the very end of the war, versus the Colonials desperately trying to get that train through to its final destination. Partisans would have objectives of blowing up rail tracks to stop the train from getting there, and a bunch of units would try to create diversionary attacks to draw fire away from the train. And of course, like I said in the beginning, this would help emphasize the units that don't often see much action in a war. This would be the perfect chance for armored trains to actually, be fielded. Single or multi-conditional victories. The question is, do factions need to be limited by a single victory condition? Take this for example. Let's just take 4 of the victory conditions I listed earlier. conquest, naval dominance, means of production, and a train reaches an enemy mass production facility. What if a faction gets 4 options, but they only need to achieve 2 of the options for victory? A faction could focus on conquest, trying to conquer all the victory points as per usual, or they could simply destroy all the enemy production facilities and conquer the naval ports. It would give factions the means to choose their own endgame, and mid-war, switch what they think their endgame or their war aims would be, giving both factions more flexibility. As an extra bonus multiplier, you could also say that not all victory conditions have to be weighed equally. It's a good thing there's no real-life equivalence where points are given based off certain objectives or destruction of certain enemy units. Moving on. Differing victory conditions. What if colonials and wardens just had different victory conditions or different war aims? Here's a historical example. The defense of Poland in 1939 at the outbreak of World War II. The German and Soviet invasion had already carved up Poland in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and they both agreed to take over certain parts of Poland. Their objectives were pretty straightforward. Destroy the Polish army in the field, and occupy the major city centers and force the collapse of the Polish government. Pretty straightforward. But for the Poles, the objectives were completely different. Their objectives weren't to take Berlin or take Moscow. They knew they couldn't do that. So their objectives were simply to hold the line as long as they could until the Allies could start a war on the Western Front and or reinforce them. Now, this never happened, but the whole point of this slide is to say the belligerent factions had completely different war aims. So why not have a version of that in Foxhole? Here's one way I see it being done. Differing roles, but same objectives. So basically, an attacker versus defender mode. Think Rush in Battlefield, or the offensive game mode in Hell Let Loose. You could have a series of objective lines for one faction, in this example the Colonials on the offensive, to take, whereas the Wardens have to hold them off. If the Wardens are able to hold them off for a certain amount of time, let's say 2 weeks or maybe 4 weeks if you want a longer war, well then that's the victory line. You hold out for that long, and maybe, I don't know, Nick Nevin brings in a bunch of reinforcements and stabilizes the line, and you win your objective by simply, surviving. But the Collies, if they can achieve all the lines of defense in this example, conquering the first line, then the second line, then the final stand, in that same amount of time, well then they're declared victorious. And then you could reverse that for the next war. The second way I see differing victory conditions working is that both factions simply just have differing victory points. So here's an example. I like to call this the Strait of Callahan example, this made-up scenario that I've developed. The objective for the Colonials and the Wardens are similar in that they have the same amount of victory points to capture, but none of them overlap. In this case, the Colonials and the Wardens would be trying to force a naval blockade of the mainland of the opposing faction by differing multi-conditional victories. That is to say, just combining everything. You can have multiple victory conditions, multiple different victory conditions for both factions. Basically, this is the chaos option. And while a quest menu in Foxhole might look absolutely chaotic, Foxhole is an MMO, and MMOs are kind of known for having very cluttered quest menus. It's probably the least likely thing to be implemented, and I don't think people would particularly like this option, but, let me know in the comments down below if you actually would like absolute chaos in terms of victory conditions. Of course, this also begs the question, with differing victory conditions, the possibility that everybody wins. The ideas I've laid out, especially with the differing victory conditions, include the possibilities of both factions winning the same war. Now, this sounds weird, but it's more common than you think. This is an Egyptian stela of the Battle of Kadesh. Funny thing is, both armies more or less fought themselves to a standstill, but both empires claimed victory in the same respective battle. With the possibility of both factions winning, this would also hopefully incentivize players on both sides, regardless if they're, quote, winning or losing, to fight till the very end, because the chance of achieving victory in a scenario where both teams can come out victorious, or at least claim they came out victorious, is far more likely than a team that's got 30 out of 32 victory points and is down to their last 2 town halls. Not impossible, but the odds are extremely unlikely. So in conclusion, Unlike war start conditions, victory conditions have never truly changed since they were introduced. Creating new ones may incentivize different playstyles and faction strategies. It would help break up the repetitiveness of wars, and some of these ideas might be terrible, but they might also be fun to play, at least once. So, thanks for watching this suggestion series. Go check out the other ones if you haven't seen them already. But my questions for the end of this one are, what victory conditions that I've listed seem the most appealing to you, and what other victory conditions might well be suited for Foxhole? And as always, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one. Bear out.